Welcome to the second edition of the Data Value Show, where data meets blockchain. We're just waiting for Lloyd to arrive at the moment, and here he is. Lloyd, welcome.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Welcome. So good to see you again, and thank you for joining the show. So Lloyd and myself go back a little way. We worked together and kept in touch for the years, and he's done some interesting stuff. So we're very honoured to have him on the show. Would you like to give a bit of background about yourself and what you've been up to recently, Lloyd?
Recently working at a company called Valence as the CTO, and what we're doing there, we're essentially a data enablement company. Prior to that, I took a company called Block Demon from pre-round to Series C, valuation of 3.25 billion, which was really, really fun for the good and bad. And in a previous life, and hopefully we won't talk about it, but I was a Royal Marines commando and a professional rugby player. That's about it.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing you mentioned earlier was data enablement, and so what would you say? How are you helping with data enablement? What do you mean in your context within Valence?
So one of the problems with data is that there is an abundance of it, and for different reasons, there is a different level of access depending on who you are, and also once you've got hold of that data, it's often challenging to turn that into something of value and be part of your business's value proposition.
Yep.
And so what we're doing at Valence is we're using various technologies. We're leaning on things like blockchain for the trust element and to allow automation of governance, and coming up with novel ways of interfacing with data to, for example, better data visualization. Sometimes when you're looking at a 2D image, it's very hard to kind of interact with that data, but something more three-dimensional where you can play with the data that you're looking at can actually unveil lots of interesting and what would have previously been undiscovered valuable information that with a normal interface you can't derive that same value.
So yeah, us humans have limitations, and three-dimensional graphs, bar graphs, donut charts, back in the day, it only gives you a very limited view of that data. And I think we chatted briefly the other day about the vector databases and having it linking and pointing to where knowledge is.
Indeed.
And the data is so rich now, it's too much for us to comprehend ourselves. So we need something to provide that graph, that indexing, that linking to take you to where that knowledge is, but also to be able to rate that knowledge and understand that is accurate or is of a quality source. So I'm always I've been banging on about business value for ages, but I'm really what we call it double downing on that subject at the moment, and working with Matt. And when we spoke and you agreed to do this, it was great to just. I always learn from having conversation with you and seeing the innovation, and you're normally on the edge of it, and your fingers on the pulse. So when you said just where blockchain meant data, that was okay. Yeah, I'd like to know more. But when we spoke, you were talking about it was the value associated to it, and I think the comment here is value has it can go up, it can go down, and I think timing of data it has an erosion time of what value it has, but also maybe increasing its worth. So is that a problem you're trying to solve with at Valence?
Yeah. So one of the problems with when you try to get, attribute value to data, it can have different values depending on the context and the customer, or rather the data owner and the data consumer. And so one of the problems that we're trying to solve is how valuable is something today. You talked about data erosion, and there's also the ability for data to become more valuable over time.
Yeah.
So on the other side of so if you move along in the other direction, going away from data erosion, if we think about data that doesn't seem so valuable today, so let's take an example. Let's think about a research paper. So for certain types of research to become known to large institutions like a Pfizer or AstraZeneca, for example, there is a restriction or a constraint around where where the data comes from that they can use. And one thing that we're looking to solve, and we're already on that journey, is this consideration around value attribution. So taking the example of a research paper, imagine that that's a node on a graph, and you've got these different weights along the edges. But now imagine that graph can change over time. And so this is where the notion of moving away from data erosion comes from, because today it's just a research paper, but later on, when Pfizer or AstraZeneca or somebody else is able to produce a new drug that doesn't exist today, that value attribution goes up, not down. So it's not eroded, it's increasing in value. And so it sounds like a really simple idea, but having the ability to bring different concepts and architectures and tools together is something that not many people are thinking about. And one interesting part of that is the trust factor, and that's where the use of blockchain comes in. And then on the other side of that as well, what's really interesting is the proliferation of AI. And so now imagine that you've got these different AI agents that are part of that data governance platform. How do you reward AI? And then that's when we can talk about or think about using blockchain to pay these different AI agents. So there's two use cases for blockchain there.
And that, I think that's exactly where I was going to go, and we didn't actually discuss that when we spoke the other day, is can having this associated value drive the associated cost or effort in actually creating, curating, expanding, validating that data. So I think what you're just saying is yes, that is
absolutely.
So you can create an ecosystem of crowdsourcing sort of knowledge of getting it, and then being rewarded for the effort that you're providing there, rather than lots of individuals maybe screen scraping and creating a little curated thing and putting it on Snowflake Marketplace, and for example, or a AWS or any other alternative as well.
Just on the crowd, so you just mentioned crowdsourcing there. So at least in the circles that you and I move in, and it can still be considered a buzzword, but this notion of DAOs. So if you think about crowdsourcing and now think, these kind of like distributed or autonomous organizations, I think the notion of crowdsourcing, as we use technology to bring in a bit more rigor and some constraints on how that works, I think crowdsourcing will just become the norm. A great example is things like you have these antiquated ideas of, I've said this recently in another talk, where I use the example of a judge and jury, 12 people deciding the fate of some case, but now imagine that you've got 11 million people doing that, because you've got this mature architecture framework with the rigors that allow you to make those decisions. You're going to have a better society.
Yeah, you are. I mean, it's great you use that analogy of the judge and the jury, because it's a post the other day and some thinking around convincing about your data strategy when you're going there and providing a business case of how much value you're going to provide from your project. You need to make that business case so watertight that you have evidence that can either be seen as the smoking gun to evidence definitely is going to add that value, or circumstantial one to create it. But you need to actually convince that whole jury. But I think what you're saying there is that process takes a long time. Whereas if you've got someone that's got put that out and validated by so many other different. So who's going to be the judges of the judges, though?
That's a great question. I was going to give you a flippant answer there and say, AI agents, but then we would then get into the kind of philosophy around, who's provided the data that they've been trained with, and then and now you've got another problem.
Yeah. So I did jump on Joe's podcast just before here, and there was the whole discussion about hallucinations, which we discussed in the AI terms the other day, just for clarification. We were talking about there's the case where the law firm it imagined a case, it made stuff up.
Yeah.
But that now, if that gets out and published, and someone can use it, or it crept through the cracks and wasn't ever seen to be incorrect, it becomes real. It's out there. But then after that, any training. So there's that. I think this blockchain thing comes into it, saying, okay, it has had so many quality checks to go in there that it is allowed to be recorded as data and being used within the insight you can provide, which then means it's a richer place for maybe AI to be trained on. So is that another avenue?
Yeah. So you've got this interesting problem that's already started to raise its head, which is, where is this data? Where is this data from? And then that affects whether you could almost rate data. This is AAA data. I absolutely trust it all the way through to B's and C's. I'm reminded of a re-watching of The Big Short recently, where these AAA loans and whatnot, mortgages rather. So part of what we're doing at Valence is we think of, I think a classic way of describing it would be an attestation service. So for a company called Verizon, one thing that we do is we use blockchain to be able to say, okay, this news article was absolutely written by Verizon, and we can attest to that. But don't trust us. Trust blockchain. And so, using AliceNet, which is our kind of blockchain infrastructure, we're able to prove, not just today, but 3 years from now, indelibly, that that news article was absolutely written, and that was the format using the hash, etc., and it's on blockchain. And so that's part of the solution that we're working on.
Yeah, we're getting quite a few questions in now, so we'll try and get through some of these. So here's one from a LinkedIn user, but I think it's probably JT. So if it is you, JT, well, hello. But if it's not, it's still a good question. So how do you feel about crowdsourced data quality?
I think that over time we will, in the same way that we trust oracles, over time crowdsourced data quality will improve, because we'll use statistical analysis and obviously AI to be able to filter out bad sources of data, eliminate bad sources of crowd members, if you like. And so over time, we will have these autonomous systems that will just keep iterating. And in the same way that DAOs work a similar way as well, where different contributors are trusted more, and therefore we have algorithms that will work in the same way to make sure that certain data sources are more trusted, and then we'll have more novel ways over the existing algorithms that we have now to make sure that the data quality improves. And then over time, crowdsourced data will become much more valuable.
Yeah, very good. I totally agree. I think is Ian, good old Ian. Let me put his question up. Yeah, I think Ian's probably just he probably knows himself. He likes to always play dumb a little bit. But yeah, so maybe for the audience, in a very much a high level, in Ian's layman's terms, well, what is blockchain? Just in case anyone out there hasn't.
It's a fair question. It's a fair question. So in layman's terms, imagine that you want to keep the accounts for whatever reason for your company or your household finances. Now, if you add an entry to your piece of paper or whatever the software is that you're using, as long as somebody, a bad actor or somebody else doesn't do anything bad, you can just go back to whatever your method of record keeping is, and that's how you can track your finances. But what blockchain does is it removes the need to worry about bad actors, and instead of just having one copy, it does a couple of different things. But at a high level, it will take the previous entries in let's call it a ledger, and then it will use mathematics to come up with an encrypted version of the next entry, such that you would have to go through every single entry since Genesis, which is the first entry, and then corrupt every single value to just change and convince other people that your version of the truth was different from the actual real one. And then the other thing that you would have to do is, because of the way consensus works, you would then have to take not just that copy of the ledger, but then replace all the other copies that exist in the world. And in the case of Bitcoin, you would have to overtake or command 51% of the network, which is,
Right.
and it's an ever-growing network. It's just not viable.
Yeah. So that builds that trust.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we got one more. Well, I think it is JT anyway, but it is one. We should package up little bad data and sell it to other people. So yeah, maybe there's an espionage, counter espionage, packaging up data and letting other people train their bots on it. I'm sure there may be some of that stuff going on. I know that Elon Musk alluded to the fact that Twitter had been being used to train bots and was reading loads of 1,000 tweets a day. So if they're training themselves on either tweets that got out via my LinkedIn, they're training on bad data with bad spelling and bad grammar. So they need to watch out where they get their sources from.
So to that point, I would, and this is not an effort, an attempt to be flippant, but what is bad data?
Yeah. So
is it untrusted data? Is it
So I would put. There's probably different classifications of bad data, because bad data can come in many forms. I think bad data could be the data that isn't there, so basically the data isn't complete. I think bad data could be from a constraint perspective, or the data types, or what's expected, how many nulls are in there, and if the values are in there map to correct codes that are either master data or reference data. And I think that's from a very much a relational sort of
yeah.
If you put it into what bad data is, you go into all the fake news aspect as well.
Indeed.
So yeah, I mean, bad data comes in any form. But if I was to summarize bad data, I think data that degrades the results of the information you're provided. So yeah,
this highlights the importance of things like data contracts and making sure that as close to the source as possible, that there's a high level of trust.
Yeah. I mean, the whole data contracts is a topic that I think Andrew Jones is just written a book on Pact that I was lucky enough to get to help him or review for some of the chapters in there. So I think the thinking then, us old ones would just all agree that it's just like an API contract, or it's just like an interface to a stored procedure contract, the input, the output, what I used to call DILs and DALs, a data input layer, a data output layer.
Wow, I'm ashamed to say that I actually know what they are.
Yeah,
that's all I am.
But we're older but a bit wiser, should we say, Lloyd? I mean, but the data contracts, and it is. I think it's that architecture 101. So been done a lot of research recently on LLMs, and we touched on vector databases. We can maybe come back to that in a second, but it's looking at how these LLMs are trained and how you can have your own personal generative AI that's trained relatively easily with open source ones that maybe don't cost you much. But go back to that architecture piece. It's building a contract for how you call these LLMs. It means you can swap it out and use whichever one's going to be the most accurate for the questions you're asking, or maybe the cost. So that whole observability or FinOps lens comes into it. So interesting. So I mentioned vector databases. So where does vector databases fit into this solution of where data meets blockchain?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that vector databases have been around, I don't want to say forever, but they've been around a lot longer than people realize. It's just, with the recency of, ChatGPT, and people wanted to run their local versions of, essentially ChatGPT lookalikes. People have been looking to things like Weaviate, not Weaviate, Pinecone is one of them, and there's a few others. Vector databases are a more efficient way of storing data to allow things like LLMs to interact with, and so you can think of them as their memory, if you like, their permanent memory. And so so they're no different essentially from a normal database, but they have interesting ways of indexing the data and storing essentially vectors, which are basically a string of numbers.
Yep.
And it's just efficiency.
So it's basically indexing and the indexing to where that knowledge is for the particular knowledge that LLM has.
Yeah, and then you've got different schemes, which I really don't want to get into because that's another show. But essentially different ways of retrieving that data, which it can start to feel very foreign if you're a relational database guru.
I think it's that bringing those world of all databases together now. So it's where you bring the document stores together with the relational databases, with your key pair databases, your blob storage, but being able to understand and catalog. And I think that leads me to the whole metadata aspect to it. And with your company, Valence, being very much a data-centric company, and whereas in some cases the source system or the operational systems are very much a separate part of the business, and the data is downstream or an add-on to it. So seeing your business is such, it is the application is the same as the data is the same as the ML. How are you tackling ops and I think the term ML ops, LLM ops, data ops, DevOps. I think I've called it ops. How do you see that world evolving?
Yeah, I think I'm not a massive fan of the word ML ops in the same way that I'm not a massive fan of the concept of DevOps, because what it conjures up is pictures of. So let's use something that people are more familiar with, which is DevOps. Okay, so even today, people, when I advise different people, they will say, okay, yeah, and so how do we go about building a DevOps team? Or, how do we go about building an ML ops team?
Mm.
And it's really not something that should be separate. And so coming back to the case of ML ops, it should be something that your data engineers are starting to become more accustomed with. I mean, obviously you bring somebody in that understands the concept of ML ops, but what you would hope to do is then, and depending on the size of the team, have said person or resource train up people that are working with data, because essentially ML ops just is something that should be close to, if not part of the daily routines of people that are involved in those data pipelines and the data manipulation, which is the data engineers and the data scientists, and not a separate thing. It's more about just including the notion of machine learning within data ops, which should be part of DevOps, which should be part of engineering.
I think it's just the full SDLC process, your software development life cycle.
Absolutely.
Back in the old days of, it's a automated deployment process with built-in testing that incorporates every single part of the journey. And if we think about that, there may be some specialisms that you'll put into it, but with the way that we've gone now, with all the tools being all metadata driven, most of them now, they go with that readable code. It's using Ginger templates or Python, or people that understand it. Looking at it, they can check it in. The days of some of these products that complicated it. The data teams had to deal with products that had catalogs. They had to be loaded in, loaded out. You couldn't automatically build it as part of your standard pipeline. I'm very pleased that that's sort of become the de facto standard now. I think GUIs are there to help with automation, but it should never lock in the code. They should be there to accelerate code creation. and not lock you into it.
Absolutely. And then, and those same GUIs should be data driven anyway. And just to pick on, where people just add on the word ops on the end of whatever acronym or word. Think of, I get mildly annoyed when people mention, DevSecOps or argue that it should be SecDevOps. Again, just this notion of adding security as part of that pipeline that you've correctly alluded to. Yep. MLOps is the same.
Yeah, and I think that it goes back down to, I think our strapline at the moment is look to the past to innovate for the future. And the SDLC cycle, it may have changed because of the cloud aspect, but all the same steps, processes, requirements haven't changed. It's just now it needs to sit across more pillars in the organization.
Absolutely.
And I think CTOs, CDOs, CEOs, when you're looking at your team structure, you'll be looking at embedding those skills within them. So it's not a separate security or not a separate governance. They are part of that decentralized capability, that they're their advisors, advising those teams, upskilling those teams, and any security should be part of your deployment process or testing process.
Absolutely. From day one.
Yeah, from any cost analysis or optimization analysis should be part of it. Any testing should be built into it at all. Any validation and rollback should be. These things aren't new, and we know from when we worked together, and we had fun in our little architecture corner in that insurance company in Newcastle, putting the world to right of all these forgotten aspects.
I forgot about that place. Yeah.
Where in fact, Rob Jagger, if you're listening, we say hi. We miss those days. I think going back down to this blockchain aspect, and trying to understand a little bit more about. Do you see that data being traded? So if we're rewarding the, I think you use it, the DAOs or the crowdsourced verification of that, there's effort in there rewarding them. That needs to come from somewhere. Are they taking a risk on the value of that data stored in that blockchain going up, or where's the remuneration aspect?
So I'm gonna put two different hats on.
Cool.
I'm going to put my kind of, and if I'm insulting anybody, I apologize. If I say
it won't be the first time, Lloyd. It won't be the first time, Lloyd, and it won't be the last. And I wouldn't have it any other way. All right. So
okay. So let me put my non-business, I love the world hat on. I think that there's a scenario where we move to a place where everybody has the same level of access to all data to make it a level playing field, and you avoid things like the situation that you have now where there's a super high financial barrier to buy certain tools that give you certain access to trading platforms, and with that trading platform you have a lens to and a game-changing amount of data that just it makes it such an uneven playing field.
Was it the latency as well as it? It's the richness and the speed access to data as well?
Well, so for instance, to do certain trades, you need certain access to, certain platforms because of the latency, and because without that, even if you had the access to the right data, you'd be behind already. And we're talking milliseconds. Yep. And so that's one side. But now if I put my business hat on, I think absolutely it's inevitable that there's going to be data that's either collected or derived from source that's going to be on a marketplace where people will choose to attribute value, financial value, or hopefully we move to a world where we pay in cryptocurrency, for said data or said information. So it's difficult to predict which one of those two paths is going to win out, but there's definitely a use case for both.
So a concept that I've got in I call it one of the business value channels that we're calling from the business value machine, which I believe is has underpinned by many foundational things that we all talk about, which enable you to create that value from data. And one of those ones is selling data. And sometimes if you have a certain market share of data that's over a certain percentage, you've got a big lump of it. But if you added that with maybe 3 other smaller data companies that have got the other 20, 25 or 15% or something, collectively that data is worth even more. But normally the one that has the majority of it has got the upper hand. So and that's where market research comes from, which is then sold back to the likes of us looking at demographic data, and it's all derived from these data sets that have been curated by third parties that have negotiated or maybe actually connected to one of those organizations. So would that be solved, or is that something that you'd be looking to provide as an alternative way for people to do?
So at Valence, what we would provide is the platforms to enable other people to solve those. So allowing people to use that data-centric platform to then build on top of to solve for either one of the use cases that I prescribe to. So it could be just to open all the things, or it could be to have this kind of marketplace where people can then see opportunity to then kind of join forces, if you like, and then either productize that union or use that to gain insights to make their own data more valuable as well.
So I think the other thing that triggered there is the quality aspect. So we talked about that trust aspect, and if you're building a platform that's going to provide all that validation, how I always refer to it as a shift left approach. I refer to it as the data quality firewall, and it should be at the point the data is first entering the ecosystem of your organization. If you put it there, the world's a much happier place, but it's not normally enforced that early, and there's certain areas that it could fall off, but it's normally the data team's problem, wrongly, I believe, and historically, which hopefully will start changing. We're there to go and pick up the pieces, and even with some good architecture designs and ways of working, of passing back that we found these issues, go and correct it at source. It's the same principles going to need to be applied to any data that's going into your ecosystem. As if you detect bad data, do you recall it's bad, but you've received it, or is it it's validated later post?
So what I would say is that if you need to worry about whether or not data's bad after it's initially come into the system, then you've already lost. And so what you need to do is you need to make sure that you have strong guarantees that any data that is actually in your system can be trusted, and even more so, the interface of said data or information, for want of a better word, will be trusted as well. And this speaks to things like zero trust architecture. So if you imagine a node that contains a piece of data, and now you make sure that wherever that data is, it kind of has this, I don't even want to say firewall, but just this outer wrapper, if you like, that no matter where that data lives, it has to negotiate, with this kind of protection of the data. As long as you have that notion at all times, you've got some very strong guarantees, if not the strongest, that you don't need to worry about the scenario that you've just alluded to. And the other, so I would say that as much as you need to still, have checks to make sure bad things don't happen, there's 2 things that need to happen. One, you need to make sure that, before any data that comes into the system, that it's absolutely trusted. And then that brings you to the second part, which is to make sure that the contributors of that data are trusted as well. So at Valence, one thing we're building first and foremost is the notion of verified decentralized identifiers. And so once you've gone through this the KYB/KYC process, you then assign off that level of trust based on those scores, and now you have this representation of this external entity that can be linked and attributed to the data that comes in from that same source. And so with these two things together, you then get that scenario where, as that data flows through the system, you've got these 2 points of governance that allow you to not need to have the bells and whistles checks of whether or not later on that system's being infiltrated with bad data.
Yeah, it goes back down to that data contracts and any data provider. That you don't only own the attribution of that data, you own the associated quality and service level agreements, and the good old thing of what we used to call it is the uptime and consistency and availability and providing that, and that's that should be part of if now we're relying on this data so much. And I think what I've seen, the whole data world evolves quite a lot, and I get a bit of joy out of seeing that. Okay, right, data modeling, it's now very much a well-known and followed and talked about activity. You go back 2 years ago, go back even further with the big data bubble. It was a forgotten art, and you just we'll work it out later. Schema on read. Just put it somewhere, and we'll find the value later. I think we really have flipped around now, as we've realised that we've got to have some good data modeling on that data. We've got to have some now good quality aspects, and I think the rise of all the observability tools out there and products is a reflection of now people understanding that we need to actually understand how that data is being used. I think I define 6 levels, I think, that of monitoring that I think collectively provide you that full observability. If there is a full observability, but it's starting with what I'd call application performance monitoring. So that bottom, the bottom part of it, the Datadogs and New Relics of the world. And then what's come about is the next level, which is the SaaS products. So all of the monitoring of the SaaS products. So looking at your Fivetran metadata, looking at your Snowflake, your BigQuery, any of the your reverse ETL tools, your SaaS version of Dagster or whatever using orchestration. So that created loads more meta. Okay, now we need another level of observability across all these things. And then the next level was, okay, well, we're running this stuff. We need to observe the schedule. So we need to look at the DAGs and the dependencies, and then your failures and restarting of it. And the next level I think you have to observe is the completeness. So you're weighing the data in at each of the stages, and you go to the next stage of making sure it's complete. And back to your point earlier about the bad data. The bad data could be data good quality, but just you're dropping stuff. You're losing because of a foreign key constraint or something, like you're losing, or a bad join or something. You're losing a whole subset of data. And then the next level is the quality of that data at the point it's ingested. So date format, no nulls, ISO codes being ISO codes, country codes being in the ranges of that are in the states they're meant to be, whatever that you are able to do at the point of ingest. And then the other one is, I touched on it, is data degradation. So data eroding over time. But this one is eroding, I suppose, the actual quality of data is eroding, but then the value and associated insight is also eroding, because you may have had some machine learning that was trained on some synthetic data that you'd created based on some good quality subset, and it got generated it all. But if you don't keep up that contract and that quality, your machine learning algorithm that you've got and trained on that synthetic data to get the most accurate Gini score possible for the best decision in the world is going to make some bad decisions, because it's missing out a whole country, or it's missing out anyone with a particular company type that wasn't mapped, or whatever thing that's been missing. Now it gives you a totally different result.
Totally. So as you were speaking and you mentioned data modeling, I was remembering a conversation that you and I had with Rob
Yeah,
about the lack of data modeling in MongoDB.
yeah,
And over the years, I've tried to not hate having conversations that involve MongoDB, but I'm just remembering all the conversations I've had with different people
uh,
where they've decided that it might be a good idea to use MongoDB. I
yeah,
hate picking on MongoDB because it has its uses, but
yeah,
often more than other databases, people would choose it because you could get away with not doing
modeling.
doing any
Yeah,
data modeling.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
why I was smiling. So
Yeah,
well,
well, I don't want to get you angry. I've seen you when you're angry. So like, and we don't want to. Yeah, we want to focus on this one and not go down a rabbit hole. But I think what you just mentioned there is that we've got all of these tools, and when you have that architecture hat and vision that you have a roadmap you're creating is you use the right tool for the right job, and so
yeah,
is every problem's a hat. Every problem, sorry, if every solution's a Sorry, hold on. If every problem's a nail, the only solution is a hammer or something. So
yeah,
you need to have the right tool for the right job, and that goes with database as well. You don't.
No, totally. So I do think there's on data degradation. I think there is a gap, which is unless you tell me otherwise,
Yeah.
but there is a gap where you spoke about having data presented to some ML function,
Mm-hmm.
and the gap that I'm thinking of is where, so let's say you've got to simplify this, let's say that you're using 100 different data points or sources for the ML function, and now imagine the thing that I believe is missing, which is some way of monitoring the world such that when any one of those points of data sources changes, that there's a trigger to run that ML function again and then update its view of the world and change the state of what it thinks is honest and true.
So it's sort of like self optimizing. So basically, always checking every single data point that it's ever used to make that decision to check to see if those change, and then triggering a change afterwards.
Yeah.
I don't know of that one there, but if anyone's listening, we're taking investment for this new product that we're just going to develop, me and Lloyd. So I think, and that goes back down to the metadata. So all of that, companies been doing a lot about the business value lens again, and it ought to be linked to the company's strategy, which should have the business strategy that should be linked to data strategy from the vision of what they want to achieve.
Indeed.
If they use that and then drive what are the KPIs, SKRs, or whatever you want to call them, what are the metrics that I need to look at to all of these things to make sure they are all heading the right direction and getting me to achieve what the business strategy is. And if you're collecting metrics or KPIs that have no mapping to that, or actually are counterproductive, or if you score well in this, you're going to affect this one here. If there's not that view in an organization, you're just collecting these metrics for the sake of it. I think I talked to the KPIs of KPIs. Let's actually do an audit of all our KPIs out there, understand how they're being used. If they're not used, get rid of them.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that things like OKRs or objectives and key results, they get a really bad rap. But I think that's because they force people to really think about what it is that they need to do. And we can talk about different mental frameworks, 5 whys, first principle thinking and whatnot. But on the KPIs, often people talk about making data-driven decisions.
Yep.
And something that I felt really helps conversations like that is if you change the language slightly and just replace the word data with information.
Yes. Yeah.
Once you start doing that, the right thing to do starts to become obvious. So on on KPIs, what information do I need to know?
Yep.
And then quite often when you change the word from data, change data for information, those conversations are much simpler to come around.
I think we've been the data world or the IT world of been too focused on the capabilities and the terminology that's describing the technical aspects, and we're not actually what do you need to achieve? What's going to make you make better decisions? What information?
Asking the why question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but in Blunt, if you're listening, you taught me that one. I always ask why, and it's asking why you need it, and I think this gives me another chain of thought here is that business process the art of the business process mapping, which there's a couple of things you mentioned. You did talk about KYC as well. Is businesses over time have evolved, and a lot of people don't understand why they're doing what they do. And I've been in very large transformations where you realize you go to a dead end or it's a full loop when you're thinking this doesn't go anywhere. You're just doing something because Tracy that used to work here used to print off this report, send it across as an attachment, and then the person you're going to speak to, well, Tracy left the company a while ago, but she just gets the stuff forwarded to Bob, and Bob goes, I delete it. And if everyone in an organization, I suppose we're all here to add value, and there's two things. You're here to work for whatever company to add value for them, but to feel like you've added value yourself, to feel self-worth, or that you're doing something. And just doing repeat tasks without asking yourself why you do it is a good thing. And not everyone does that, I think. And but having all those business processes mapped out gives you the ability to look to where you can optimize. And so the thought of the process here is that if you can't measure it, you can't optimize it.
Absolutely. So this is why it's important to people don't like writing things down, right?
Yep.
And something I'm a huge fan of is things like lightweight architecture decision records. So you spoke about Bob, and I can't remember what
Tracy was the other one, but they're fictitious. Okay. No one's been picked on.
Yeah, and essentially you've got these ideas, these processes that live in people's heads, and they're but if they were on a on a digital document somewhere, as you've got people coming in and out of this organization, you've always got something, the golden source of truth to refer to. So yeah, I completely I've seen that scenario so many times.
But it links on to the thing you mentioned earlier about tracing back the sources to when you go to recalculate, retrain something, reevaluate a decision because something's changed. In the same way, if you flip it around, is if you're able to collect that metadata as part of the business processes that are happening and get the terms of engagement of what the parameters were at that point, and then you're able to replay any optimization. So two scenarios. So maybe there's the capturing of data on a form, as the data capture stage. The form may be a bit clunky, the drop-down boxes don't work on Firefox or Edge or something like that. So you get a drop-off of those ones. So you're losing people on that part of the journey. But then the other part of the journey might be the KYC checks. You might be letting too many people through. You might be having too many false negatives. But if you're able to play that data back afterwards, if you collect all that metadata and go, no, I can evidence now if I had have changed these forms to work in this way, we would have achieved this much throughput. If we had have used this KYC service that gives you this more of an accuracy, we would have not had as much fraud, or we would have onboarded people that become good clients. And I think that goes back down to that whole evidence, and using that judge analogy that you mentioned earlier, and one I'm using as well in this article is, you need to be able to provide as much evidence as possible to show why you're doing something, and that all links back to business processes. I think it links back to how the data's used, the associated lineage of where that data's come from a quality, from a reprocessing, from an accuracy perspective as well.
Yeah, totally. And so as you're explaining all of that, the one word that kept popping up into my mind was risk. Yep. And putting all these things in place to make sure that you reduce, the risk of reputational loss because, the KYC, KYB system is not working properly. the reduction of bad decisions, because you're reducing the risk of using bad data. Risk just keeps popping up, and you'll know from experience, when you're doing like a solution architecture document, a lot of the thought goes into, well, for different reasons. One, for getting through the TDA, but also the actual work that you're there to do, which is to make sure that you don't introduce risk.
Yeah. I think the challenge though, and is evidencing the risk and risk appetite for different organisations. Different organisations will have a different appetite, and the appetite for risk is much less after they've just had a breach. But you want to, as architects and advisors, you want to prevent that happening. But to get to convince them, without scaremongering, it's much harder to get a project across the line on associated risk.
It's actually So on the risk thing, it's not avoiding all the risk, right? It's making sure that you find the right trade-off. I used to work at, well, more than one bank, but one bank in particular, and somebody who may or may not have been in charge of security thought that risk was essentially just making it impossible to access everything, and that's probably not the way. Which is akin to digging a hole in the garden and burying the thing and not telling anybody that you even put the thing in the hole. So you need to find that. You're absolutely right. You need to find that right line. You need to find that trade-off.
I've been in other situations where they've been so risk averse they've gone encryption crazy. So it meant that everything had to be de-encrypted to even do the filtering, which meant it was highly unperformant. And I think it's that governance. So those approaches in governance have not helped the governance world with their credibility, and it's not what they're there for. And if you work with some good governance people, and I've worked with some great ones, it's about taking policy to reality, and by taking that policy and being able to convert it into a solution that can actually be implemented, that is not going to prevent your business running. And as soon as you add, I like to use the word friction, if you add too much friction to your processes, there's two things that happen. One, it takes much longer to do everything. I think people circumvent it, and you'll get, shadow IT happening. You'll get things being downloaded and emailed across, because not everything's watertight, and you actually create a bigger security risk than just having appropriate controls. The right guardrails, the right levels of trust. And I think that comes back down to like data literacy. And we're all clever people, or we're all not stupid. We're in this industry. We should be trusted in anything, right? If it is this data type, you scramble it or something, or make sure you're not using real data in production, or have a good break glass process. If you go in there, it's temporary. I don't want to go in there. It's a read only account. Have the right guardrails, but don't make it so difficult that it's making people impossible to do their jobs, because they won't be happy. They'll work around it, and you'll probably create more risk.
Absolutely. You just highlighted something. Well, it made me think of like a use case where you can have, if you're not really thinking about the business and you think too myopically and add too much rigor, you said it perfectly. You can end up hurting the business, right? A great example. I don't know why this isn't more prevalent, but I always insist on ensuring that any log files are not stored in the same place that they're produced. So, for example, if I've got said virtual machine and it's producing log files, make sure that those files are slurped off somewhere else. And I've gone into organizations where there's these insane restrictions on how you can get access to the virtual machine. There's been cases where the virtual machine elements of it have been copied to another place, and then there's an SSH policy where not even using SSHCA, just insane rigor around how you get a temporary key, instead of taking a step back, thinking about the business and just removing the need to even log into the virtual machine in the first place, and just thinking ahead and having all the log files behind a single pane of glass. Just things like that.
Yeah, we do like to make ourselves complicated here, and I'll go back to, I think it's the next thing that's missing now. I did a few posts around this. I think it's the lost art of architecture. We've forgotten that we need to design things. I gave two analogies recently. One was a Jenga game. So your modern data stack's got wobbly because you've taken too many pieces in and out your stack because it wasn't well architected. And I think the other one was about stalactites and stalagmites. So that the business and IT aren't joined unless that architecture fills that vision of that gap between bridging the two areas and provide that roadmap of how you actually increase value from your data and your development, your IT capabilities in general.
Yeah. For some reason, software. So it's given this moniker of being an engineering discipline, and it really isn't. And I think that what you've got now is you and I have talked about enterprise architecture, and some very strong feelings on that. I think that there is a place for the enterprise architecture paradigm, but I am a strong believer in having the enterprise architect involved at all different levels. Some people argue that if somebody's not able to write code, then they have no place being an enterprise architect. But that's hogwash. What they need is an understanding of what's involved, and it certainly makes it easier to understand what people are doing on a day-to-day basis. But to take your example of Jenga, the problem is that when people are not thinking properly about architecture, they restrict themselves and think, okay, I've got these Jenga blocks and the rules of the game are this, and therefore I'm going to restrict myself in this way. An enterprise architect will say, actually, let's just use concrete for the bottom part of the Jenga stack.
Yeah, I think the size of the organization maturity probably span that whole architecture sort of mentality or need for one. And I refer to, and no offense, I've worked with some great ones, the enterprise architects sitting in their ivory towers and not connected to reality. But I think I've also been accused myself of not being connected to reality in my architecture. But I have come from a technical background and gone into that and sitting between them. So I think what I'd like to see is a more architectural mindset in the engineering, right? And it doesn't have to be a separate role, but have a design you're working towards, even if it's a senior data engineer that's doing that, or someone that architectural vision should be part of your organization.
Absolutely.
And without it,
I think a lot of times you have this situation where, in fact, I'm not going to say a lot. Always, there's always somebody that wants to use said software because it's cool. And instead of thinking, okay, why are we building this thing in the first place, and why does the business need this?
Exactly.
These are the kind of things that architects think. Just it's not just the code. It's how the idea of building this thing rolls up into the business strategy and the vision of the business itself.
Yeah, I think I've used Tetris for this one. Is the architects working out, actually, I've got this project that can produce this shape, this one produces that shape, I can join them to do, which gives me the ability to put these shapes on top. And it's that working out, and I refer to these projects as your vehicles that are helping on your journey, and each of them can play a different part or provide the foundations that help enable other pieces. So we're coming up to close to end, but I want to give everyone a chance to talk to it, tell everyone where they can find you if they want to reach out to you, if they want to know any more.
So I'm not on many things, but you can definitely find me on LinkedIn. You can get me on my Valence email at lloyd@valence.xyz. We're on Discord as well at Get Valence. Just reach out if you've got any questions. Let me know. I'm here.
Cool. All right. Well, as always, we could carry on chatting for a while. It's more fun with beer, but obviously, for you it's okay, acceptable. But for me, it's still midday anyway, so I've got a little while to wait till I get mine out. But it's been an absolute pleasure. I'll just show you who we got on next. Anyway, I'll just add to. So we've got Scott Taylor on the 24th. I think this is a great topic about selling your data project. So your team should be seen as being your internal sales and marketing team for your data project. So be thrilled having that. We may have some other people between, but this one's all scheduled and ready to go. So yeah, we may have something next Monday. I haven't got anything set in stone yet, but please do follow the Leap Data YouTube channel, so you'll get to see these things, or join our mailing list so you can get updates when these are on the topics or on them. And as always, thank you for everyone for their questions. I see a good lot of familiar faces. I wasn't able to multitask and like all the comments yet, but I think I've got most of the questions out. But yeah, thanks Lloyd, and thanks everyone, and we'll speak to you all soon. Take care.
Thanks, Chris. Bye-bye.